transition and industrialization agendas while being responsive to the call for climate action. This caught between a rock and a hard place situation alerts us that we should caution against copy and paste solutions when it comes to green infrastructure and industrialization solutions. So, what should we do, you may ask? I'm not going to steal the thunder of our esteemed panelists, but what I can say is that they applied futures research methods, which is a disciplined analysis of alternative futures. The intention of this nonlinear approach is that it aims to support policymakers in making better informed decisions, having considered future eventualities, scenarios, and outcomes. In times of rapid change and uncertainty, responsible policy making account. In addition, foresight helps policy about the future and prepare for a broader set of possibilities. I want to underline and stress the word possibilities, because the aim of this research is not to predict the future or to define a specific future, but to create capacities to prepare for a broader set of possibilities. Through this process, we open up the future by inspiring new actions which can be taken today to create pathways for alternative outcomes. Back to our research topic. In the SADC region, there is no shortage of policies and frameworks and checklists to secure more inclusive and equitable outcomes. These frameworks and policies are freely available, and it is also quite accessible. We also see in the news that China is the leading financier of regional infrastructure projects and how these projects support natural resource exploitation to meet the industrialization goals and infrastructure demands, including the societal services and trade development objectives. Of significance is that these articles are mostly silent on the climate impacts, or rather the green developments. Notwithstanding pockets of positive development, the region remains confronted with societal challenges such as persistent poverty, food security, and healthcare. To plan for uncertainty requires novel approaches. The research papers, which you can also download from the SAIA website, highlight an urgency to better prepare and co-create systemic innovations to forge or shape new trajectories of green development in the region. Allow me to introduce our panelists who will share more about green development in the SADC region. First up, we have Dr. Marius Oosthuizen, who's also the Scenarios Director at the World Energy Council, and he will share some key impacts about his paper. That would be followed by Mr. Msumelo Nyadyapi, who is the Senior Associate of PricewaterhouseCoopers, and thereafter we'll hand over to Dr. Stephen Litchi, who's a consultant at Real Consulting, to talk about green industrialization, which will be followed by Dr. Dion Kluti, who is the Futures Program Head at SAIA. And thereafter, we would open up for a question and answer session. Please do not wait for that session. Right at the end, you are more than welcome to type your questions in the chat, and we'll try and address each and every one of that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Marius Oosthuizen.
Thank you, Letitia, and hello, colleagues. Great to be with all of you. Letitia, I should mention that in your opening, I had a couple of pauses in the connection. If the cause of that is on my side, please alert me to that, and I might then switch my video off momentarily to prevent that. Colleagues, it's great to share with you for a few minutes about the research we've done. I'm going to start and move quite quickly, in fact, and share with you from the study. As Letitia mentioned, we did a foresight study on the future of green infrastructure in SADC. Analytically, what did we do? We looked at a range of different factors, cutting across economic, ecological, political, geopolitical, cultural, social, and other geographic factors. As she rightly said in the introduction, the realities on the ground of infrastructure, whether it's political or social, whether it's economic or geological or geographic, are unique to SADC. And so we needed to start at that very fundamental level to understand how the specific economics, the specific politics, the geographical and cultural and other factors of this region are unique to this region and will interact in order to shape the future of infrastructure in this region. The second thing that we did, which is quite important, is we looked at the legacy of infrastructure. As you know, infrastructure is not an overnight game. It's a long-term structural reality. And so without getting into the detail on these charts, we looked at SADC's railways, we looked at the regional network around infrastructure, roads, nodes, etc. And then we looked at the way that ICTs and digital connectivity is changing the nature of interconnectedness in SADC. Now, just at a visual level, if you look at the region, it's very evident to see the dominance of the Gauteng region flowing out from Gauteng across South Africa, the corridor from Cape Town through Gauteng into Zambia and beyond. And so one of the fundamental questions we need to ask if we think about the future of infrastructure is, how does SADC break out of the lock-in legacy features of infrastructure that has affected the region? And of course, many of these lock-in features are a function of colonialism, a function of the history of the region. And so with those underpinning analytical steps, we analyzed what are the systemic factors that are going to shape infrastructure in the region. And what I've got here on this graph is, or this chart, is a very simple analytical lens to say, well, how is infrastructure likely to emerge in the future? And it's very simple that on the left-hand side, there's a range of drivers around people, whether it's population increase, migration, urbanization, energy demand. On the right-hand side, there's a set of drivers around infrastructure, whether it's aging infrastructure, the deindustrialization of the economy, climate pressures. And what we think is going to happen is these different drivers of people and aging economic infrastructure is going to put enormous pressure on the governance environment of infrastructure. And this is the heart of the issue. The way in which policymakers make decisions in the next 20 years, 30 years, is going to be fundamentally shaped by this growth in population, this migration of populations towards urban centers, but at the same time, the aging of the old industrial infrastructure. And there's a question mark as to whether the politicians and the policymakers respond to that pressure through populism, or whether they take a much more visionary and regenerative approach. And this is where we'd like to go next. I want to propose to you two fundamental paradigm shifts that we've employed in this paper that will open up a visionary conversation for infrastructure in the region. The first is borrowing from the concept of donut economics, from the very famous book by the same name, Donut Economics, which looks at this notion of a donut, saying that at the outer edge, you have the possibility for ecological overshoot. And at the center, you have the need for a societal foundation or a social foundation. And so what we learned from that is we need to operate within the safety zone of that, the safe, just operating space for humanity. And so number one, can we develop an infrastructure future within the limits of the planet that provides a solid societal foundation for development? And number two, to take you onto another chart, can we move infrastructure in SADC from the bottom left, which is an extractive, degenerating system that is carbon-based, that is bad for the environment, that is unhelpful to populations? If you imagine upwards of 70% of SADC residents having no proximity to major highways, major rail, can we move from this unhelpful, degenerative bottom left to a regenerative system on the top right, where the infrastructure itself is not only less energy consuming or less carbon emitting, but the infrastructure itself becomes an engine of growth, of green growth, job growth, and inclusion, economic and other forms of inclusion. Now, we explored those trends and those drivers of change. And what we discovered, and I'm going to move quite quickly to my initial conclusion here, what we discovered is that there's a need for a fundamental shift in the mindset of the politicians, the governments, the policymakers in SADC. On the left-hand side, we have the current mindset, or what we might call the logic that dominates the infrastructure conversation. In the left-hand side logic, economic imperatives and political imperatives decide where we build a bridge, a road, a highway, or a building, and the shape and nature of that building. And so socio-ecological outcomes are left behind. What we need to do is move from left to right through political incentives, market incentives, and civic incentives to a regenerative logic that puts socio-ecological imperatives, the well-being of humans and the well-being of their natural habitat, at the center of the infrastructure conversation. Once we do that, once we align the politics around the socio-economic imperative or the socio-ecological imperative, we then find the economic outcomes or outputs that benefit from that. And so let me demonstrate what this could look like very quickly through three visionary scenarios for the future of infrastructure. The first is a radical land use conversion scenario. It's a scenario in which the leaders of SADC recognize that the only way to transform the future of infrastructure in SADC is if we fundamentally rethink the use of land and, as a consequence, the pattern of infrastructure that is developed in the region. And we see the region adopting somewhat of what I called here a Marshall Plan for regenerative infrastructure. It's a top-down, state-led, collaborative effort to fundamentally change the destiny of infrastructure in SADC, putting socio-ecology at the center of the investment conversation. The second option is a second scenario, which we call the food, water, energy, housing nexus. In other words, there's a story that unfolds where SADC, and that is the citizens of SADC, the businesses operating in the region, create what we call CANs, community action networks, where they cluster around the very local or place-based imperatives for food, for water, for energy, and for shelter or housing. And they start to create regenerative patterns of development that put these fundamental human needs at the center. It's a very exciting scenario if you're in civil society and you want to drive bottom-up emergent change. And then the last scenario is what I call the place-based livelihood scenario. This is a very interesting scenario. It's not quite a top-down Marshall Plan, and it's not quite a bottom-up CAN-based or civic-based scenario. It's a scenario where the business community, along with the development finance institutions like the World Bank, the DBSA, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, the Africa Development Bank, leverage ESG incentives, ecological, social, and governance incentives to crowd in global finance for reinvestment in infrastructure in SADC, bringing about carbon credits and the transformation of the footprint of SADC's infrastructure. I've intentionally moved quite quickly and laid out quite a broad buffet of ideas. I'm happy to pause there and look forward to a rich discussion with our panelists. Thank you, Letitia.
Thank you very much, Marius. That was very, very insightful, especially the three scenarios and the regenerative economy. Our first panelist, just to respond to what you've just mentioned, is Msimelelo Ntoyapi. Just a quick question to you. What do you believe to be the barriers and opportunities of this regenerative economy, as Marius just pointed out?
Thank you so much, Letitia. First, I must just apologize. I'm currently experiencing a power outage, so I'm going to keep my camera off just for connectivity purposes while I tackle some of the questions that you might pose today. Okay, thank you so much. Can I also just kindly request that you repeat that question for me?
Okay. Not a problem. What do you believe to be the barriers and opportunities of this regenerative economy, as Marius just pointed out?
All right. So I've had the opportunity to read this, although to read the reports, although not in sufficient time, right? So there's a bunch of these that are covered in this, and I'm only going to pick just about five barriers, of course. And I think the first one to note is that there's no common understanding about what to actually consider sustainable investment that exists in the financial markets. The current economic system heavily incentivizes extractive and exploitative practices. And then there's the concept of short-termism. The focus on short-term profits often overshadows long-term sustainability considerations, hindering investment. And then the third is the lack of data and measurement, which makes it difficult to quantify the benefits of this regenerative economy. And then there's a limited consumer awareness, where many consumers are unaware of the benefits, making it a challenge to create a strong market around this. Then governance, where policy and regulatory barriers, where existing policies and regulations may not support or in fact even hinder the practices. The second part of your question that talks to opportunities, there are obviously, from the research done here, wonderful research, by the way, environmental benefits that can help restore the ecosystems, improve soil health and reduce pollution, ultimately leading to a healthier and more resilient environment. Then there's the economic resilience, by restoring natural capital. Regenerative businesses can also contribute to a more resilient economy, reducing the risk of environmental shocks and disasters. Then there's also the social benefit, where regenerative practices can foster community engagement, improve livelihoods, and promote social equity, leading to more just and equitable society. And then there's the notion of innovation and growth, where new economic opportunities can arise in the various sectors, including agriculture, renewable energy, and so forth. And of course, we already touched on consumer awareness, and I feel though that there's an opportunity there to increase that, and increase products and services grow, and consumer demand is likely to increase. Thanks, Letitia.
Thank you, Msumelo. Marius, I just want to probe back to you a little bit. You very much talk about this notion of lock-in. So the current infrastructure is in a lock-in mechanism, and how do we move that lock-in to a lock-on from a regenerative economy perspective? One of the key things that obviously drives infrastructure would be, how to get capital on capital markets, and how to fund these infrastructure projects. I'm sure you touched on it within your different scenarios about, what possible alternative financing options could be available for this regenerative economy. Maybe you could just touch on that very briefly.
Thank you, Letitia. I like your comment about moving from locked in to locked on. I think that there are a number of things to say. The one is that our panelist is quite right. Every one of those obstacles or barriers also represents a lever for change. And so, whether it's about defining what we mean by sustainability, there is a need to make that definition, and including in the financial markets. What we are seeing worldwide is that finance institutions are moving from a for-profit towards a for-profit people and planet, and then even beyond that to a more purposeful perception of business or understanding of business. If you look at the measures that investors are using to decide where funding should flow, increasingly they're using not just ESG measures, but very specific societal purpose as a prerequisite for approving those investments. And so we see that shift happening. And so in SADC, where we do have very large societal needs, whether it's gender equity, whether it's the empowerment of youth, there's a case to be made to the financial markets that investment in infrastructure in this part of the world will not only address those economic imperatives and lead to new economic growth, as infrastructure often does as an upstream input in the economy, but a need to address those societal goods that unlock that. Now, in our paper, we contemplated something beyond the PPP. So public-private partnerships are very popular in Africa. They sometimes are complex and difficult to structure because of issues of governance. But we've gone beyond that to contemplate what we call a CPPP, which is a civic public-private partnership, where there's a notion that as African society, we have to come together and create a vision and an understanding of what is the future, the regenerative future we want, that is not going to be given to us by the private sector through markets. It's not going to be given to us by politicians who are on a short-term election cycle. It has to be a societal vision around which we then wrap a PPP, blended finance. There are obviously many models that we could use to mobilize that capital. And it might be that we mobilize some of that capital through DFIs, development finance institutions, some of it through private markets, or some of it even through crowdsourcing as we harness the powers of big data, artificial intelligence, the use of technology that's become available to us of late. Back to you, Letitia.
Thank you so much, Marius. With that said, I think we're at an opportune time now to move over to the next paper, which is SADC Futures of Green Industrialization, a call for an alternative paradigm. I think it leads very well into, from Marius's view of donut economics, moving into regenerative economy, the regenerative economy, and now looking at yet an alternative paradigm for green industrialization. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Stephen Litchi, who will be talking to us about that paper.
Thanks, Letitia. Let me get a screen shared here. Okay, great. And let me get you to the beginning here. So thanks, Marius. You actually laid a great foundation for what I kind of wanted to talk about. We're going to share similar slides that you pulled from. This paper is looking, instead of an infrastructure, looking at industrialization. I think there's a lot of paradigms, premises, policy recommendations that overlap between these two. I will dive into looking more at that regenerative component that you mentioned, Marius, as well. And then kind of looking at the two dimensions of green industrialization, as is kind of commonly used in the literature, how industries pursue green strategies and which green enterprises provide environmental goods and services. I actually think it's a little bit more multidimensional than that, but that's kind of the components that we were looking at here. Was bringing Daniel Christian Wall is kind of the initiator of this regenerative sort of approaches. He has eight principles that are here. This paper really honed in on the sixth sort of principle, the mental models, worldviews, and paradigms, as you have already mentioned, Marius, to some degree. In this paper, we also used a futures method called Futures Triangle, looking at the pushes of the present, pulls of the future, as well as weights of the past to develop three sort of scenarios. I'll explain what each of these three scenarios are here in a little bit, but let me lay this over where they fit with the regenerative sort of framework. So Marcus provided kind of a vertical orientation of the regenerative continuum. This is more of a horizontal. And if you look at Wall's work, he really only focuses on the five kind of on the right. And what I've done, just to demonstrate worst case scenarios, I've added two additional ones, which is exploitive and destructive. Destructive means the environmental conditions that have been changed, the ecological conditions we cannot return from it. The exploitive, it's destruction, but it's reversible. So scenario one, kind of the business as usual. Scenario B is a worst case scenario. And scenario C is this regenerative sort of principle that we would like to maybe push SADC to consider when it comes to looking at possible future scenarios. So here they are laid out. Short-term success, long-term loss is scenario A. Scenario B is this apocalyptic Africa. This is where Africa is on fire, where we can think of just about anything that can go wrong in the SADC region is going wrong. And scenario C is where there is this major narrative and paradigm shift across SADC. And we overcome a lot of these boundary sort of issues that when you look at a lot of the challenges in the SADC region, we can divide it by member states, but we can also divide it within regions. And then we find out that a lot of issues are actually sitting on border sort of regions and so forth that are beyond just a normal state sort of control. So these are kind of the three scenarios. Again, these are developed more in the paper. I encourage you to have a look there. Then we also used causal layered analysis to dive a little bit deeper into the development policies and strategies. Again, like any sort of complex issue, the literature, the news cycles, the policy recommendations often sit at the top two elements of this, the headlines, the systems and structures. But to really bring long-term change requires diving into these hidden sort of elements that is related to the worldviews, the mental models and paradigms, and then even deeper into the myths and metaphors. And this was done mostly through a literature review and so forth. Ideally, you know, with proper sort of funding, we could jump into these SADC sort of environments and take a lot of the policymakers through those myths and metaphors, those worldviews and so forth. But a lot of it is apparent in the literature. So here are approximately 7 or 8 sort of challenges revealed by causal layered analysis. I'm just going to focus on the latter 3, which is really oriented around reinvigorating Africa's indigenous knowledge systems and principles, making this these deeper paradigms and mental models, shifting them into a more well-being and regenerative sort of strategies for SADC. And then small is beautiful, going back to Schumacher's work in the 1970s that was looking at regenerative economics as if people mattered. So I think that's often what gets overlooked in policies, even though that it's there. Policies are often driven by other sort of motives. Before I jump into the policy recommendations, and then a final chart that I want to show and maybe focus our conversation around that is just looking at systems change. And FSG's 6 conditions of system change, I think, lays out a really powerful sort of model that the transformative change, the implicit sort of change, is often at the mental model sort of level. The policies, the practices, and the resource flows, they sit at the top and they represent structural explicit sort of change. But the really true transformative change is moving down to the bottom of this triangle. And then to bring in Donella Meadows, 12 points in her leverage, in her view of where you bring change. If you look again at this diagram that I've created, a lever trying to move the system, if we jump up and down toward the fulcrum, the skills, the resources, the service buffers, the infrastructure, we break this lever, and we have been breaking this lever again and again. And what this paper is suggesting is we need to move further out on the lever into where the paradigms used to design the system and the power to shift paradigms to deal with new challenges. This is where you're going to find the greater leverage. This is not something that happens overnight. Unfortunately, it doesn't even happen within election cycles, but something deeper within vested stakeholders in the SADC region can possibly be using this to think how to move forward. So again, here were the 8 policy recommendations from the paper. I'm not going to dive into all 8 of these, but again, touch on number 5, which is reimagining Ubuntu and Ukama principles and other African indigenous knowledge systems and consider their application to regenerative approaches for the future of industrialization. So this one might be the most unrealistic one, but I think the point of a lot of futures work and building scenarios is to really push the boundaries of thinking. And this next chart captures a vicious circle versus a virtuous circle. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of these details, but the Ubuntu philosophy creates these nurturing, regenerative sort of cultures that are important for bringing these necessary change that I think would really resonate with so much of the population in SADC outside of elite circles. And then let me just conclude with this last slide. This is what I'm calling a need for an African about face. When we look at the Human Development Index, the three countries typically always at the bottom: Chad, Central African Republic, and Niger. Granted, these are not in the SADC region. Mozambique, Malawi are often in this category. Madagascar is often in this category. But this is more for illustrative purposes. And the top three, typically Switzerland, Ireland, Norway. What some of the most cutting edge work done in the regenerative sort of principles are in some of these high HDI countries, where they are looking at future sustainable and green trends in advanced economies. Marius talked about the donut economics. The city of Amsterdam is adopting a donut economic model. So some of the most forward-thinking, most advanced on the Human Development Index are looking toward these sort of trends. What I am arguing here, and what the paper is suggesting, is that if Africa would do an about face, a 180 turn, embrace a lot of the really deep indigenous ideas of ecological concerns for society, looking at the ancestors, looking at the future generations, looking at our engagement with our ecological environment, that there is an immense wealth of thought within the African context, within African knowledge systems, that actually can lead the way, not just for Africa, but for the world, in bringing these green, sustainable, restorative, and regenerative sort of cultures. So instead of always following a linear model where many African nations will always be at the bottom of this index, to turn 180 and embrace an African viewpoint, an African paradigm, and lead the way in bringing these regenerative sort of cultures on the continent. So I will conclude there, Letitia, and look forward to comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was also very, very insightful. I think we've got some questions for Dion. I think, Dion, what are some of the policy challenges for enabling and promoting green industrialization? So I think Stephen and Marius both spoke about this whole paradigm shift that's needed and the opportunity for the African continent to really lead the way. But what are some of the policy challenges that you think one would encounter?
Yeah, there's so many areas we can touch on this conversation in terms of green industrialization. Just for instance, just within South Africa, there's different narratives and ideas and approaches to understanding what the just transition might be like for to enter a decarbonized economy towards net zero in terms of energy use. Without energy, industrialization is not really possible. So, and then there's also the role of certain policies currently in place, which are there is new movement, especially by important players like the Presidential Climate Commission, that are creating a more coordinated, harmonized narrative. But on a regional level, you see the SADC Secretariat, for instance, they've got the Green Economy Strategy for Southern Africa, and an implementation action and implementation plan. But not many countries have actually necessarily signed on to adopted, ratified, and made sure that they align and harmonize these policies into their approach within the region. So on a regional level, you see the dominance of state sovereignty over and above regional integrational approaches and creating coordination that would be beneficial to the entire region. Now, one can understand that many of these countries would like to have some mode of sovereignty, but if one has to rethink and reimagine industrialization, considering what Marius has said with the challenges in infrastructure, the challenges of renewable, and the massive build of alternative and new technology infrastructures required within the next 10 years, one has to really take a careful look at what options are available. Now, in terms of our work on industrialization, it is quite important to make sure that, these SADC member states actually has the capacity to develop strategic foresight and understand these macro trends. So there's firstly, key decision makers need to understand how these long-term understanding of the future is already acting on the present. And for instance, although both of the reports we are releasing today are forward-looking 10 to 30 years out, we already see clear signs of many of these trends impacting on society today and on the region. So, for instance, if one do not develop the anticipation capabilities to develop these monitoring tools, for instance, there's interesting institutes like the Earth Policy Institute that tracks 12 trends to measure progress towards the creation of sustainable economies. And then they track like population, global economy, grain and harvest, fish catch, forest cover, water resources, and carbon emissions or global temperatures, amount of ice melting, and even practical things like wind power coming on grid, bicycle production, and solar power. You know, these are type of things that are really practical and that should be tracked in terms of a regional response to see how we actually transitioning to within these environments and how we can better anticipate and build green industrialization in the region. On top of that, we've already mentioned that in the long term, but also in the short term, we need to understand that the new green narrative and paradigm needs to emerge that does not merely adopt either other continental understandings or approaches, but really embeds African understanding of what's required in our context, in our regions, and would be appropriate to the developments within our developmental understandings. And that can include developing new pricing policies and regulations that really foster incentives for green products and processes, but also taking the steps to build firm capacity and improving of governance structures, creating governance structures that are transparent and open and sharing, and really enabling and strengthening governance structures by appointing of key capable personnel, and then also really enabling the entrepreneurial activities and landscape in that sense from the top down and bottom up level. So those are some of the areas we tracked. What is also emerging from our point of view is that really, although the SADC Secretariat, for instance, plays an important harmonization role, we see clearly that South Africa is the largest, like 60% of the entire, percent of economic trade is basically the component of South Africa. And though they play a large role, we don't see them necessarily engaging on that stage to drive. It's like South Africa is very inward looking, where one would like to see South Africa taking a regional role to push this type of new thinking that really would not just to re-enable or keep this locking going, where you have a infrastructure that's out of date. You have a reactive approach to policy implementation and putting out fires, while proactive approaches can be taken to really embed new approaches like the regenerative principles that Stephen alluded to, but also really creating a new mental models and worldviews that drive new behaviors. So that can be through creating new market investments, financing a consumer demand, and creating awareness-based systems change, which is really kind of a approach where this awareness of how we think and how we interrogate our assumptions about economies and how things happen really are interrogated through critically allowing for reflective spaces. So Example of that might be the United Nations Development Program and working with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, as well as the Presencing Institute that developed this whole series of dialogues on capacities for awareness-based collective action, where you really get this type of partnership that fosters the movement for that with the key decision makers to learning the interconnections that are needed to cultivate this transformational type of change that's required. So that's an example of what can actually be done. Then, from my point of view, also, when we think about industrialization, it's also about how you design systems, of course, and how we typically design things might not be appropriate for the future. So what we are promoting in this the work is to utilize ecological design, and then there's the fancy term of biomimicry, which basically you incorporate nature design principles into your design, so that you can already see, for instance, some wind turbines have been redesigned to look like trees and to not have these long wingspans, but the effectivity in terms of technological design seems to still be up there. So these are type of kind of design implementation technologies that you have there. There's also speculative design, which is really a approach where you keep on experimenting and until you find a way to break through of something that's really developing and going according to these nature inspired innovative approaches. So that this type of understanding of how you design from the beginning for change is quite important, rather than just adopting business as usual approaches to looking about industrialization. Of course, money comes into the play, and how you invest and find the type of investments for this is the key challenge. But with that being said, we can go big and go small at the same time. And this type of thinking of both and going big and small at the same time and rethinking current industrialization practices are quite important. So where we are advancing this idea of pursuing top-out and bottom-in approaches. The top-out refers to this proactive engagement with the global powers and continental, the African Union, SADC, regional economic commissions, the national governments, and then also trying to work out on, say, from a diplomatic level, say energy or industrial or trade oriented diplomatic level, what are the options? But then there's also the approach of to really go for the bottom in approaches, where you really trying to entail to marginalize the regions where you're working from at the real poverty levels, peri-urban levels, the disadvantaged, the marginalized, and bringing in real industry and manufacturing efforts into these regions, where you typically see, many of these people's urban people coming to either cities or seeing migration trends towards other African regions or Europe. These due to natural disasters or many other challenges. We want to really build anticipatory capacity to build resilient responses to these marginalized communities through long-term thinking about how industrialization can change the shape of Southern Africa. Back to you, Letitia.
Thank you so much, Dion. I see we have quite a few questions in the chat. Marius, I think the first question is to you, which is about there are major infrastructure problems. Sorry, let me see. Sorry, not for Marius, it is for Marius. There are major infrastructure problems, rail, electrical grids, etc. Are there significant political engagement across borders to develop and improve on the infrastructure
Letitia, we can't hear you. Just maybe switch your video off and try again.
Oh, sorry about that. This question is for Marius. It's about major infrastructure problems regarding rail, electrical grid, etc. Are there significant political engagement across borders to develop and improve on the infrastructure in a collaborative way?
Thank you, Letitia, and thank you, Ulrich, for posting that question in the chat. Others feel free to use the chat, of course, as well. I think that we have to face up to the fact that Africa, SADC in particular's advanced industrial infrastructure has really lacked maintenance, repair, and the political and governance will to keep that infrastructure up to date. And so we do see the destruction of infrastructure. We see through things like looting, we see infrastructure cable theft, we see the aging of road infrastructure, bridges, etc., and there has not been the investment to maintain those. But if you begin to consider that a large proportion of the SADC population do not work in the formal economy, then, and even though they might use public transport like taxis or buses, the benefit to that proportion of the public of that core aging industrial infrastructure is actually very small. And so we've got a double problem in SADC in that we, on the one hand, have to upgrade and update the existing infrastructure we have. But the more interesting challenge, perhaps the more exciting challenge, is what does the infrastructure of the future look like? So if you imagine a young urban worker in Windhoek or in Maputo, and they're using technology, they're in the services economy, or they're doing small-scale, very bespoke manufacturing, using additive manufacturing like 3D printing, and they're producing those products or services for regional African markets, or even for markets in Asia, or markets in Latin America or the US. What does export infrastructure of the future look like? Is it rail? Is it lightweight drone technology? Is it alternative forms? Is it battery-powered road-based infrastructure? So the more fundamental strategic question of, number one, what is industrial infrastructure in the future? Number two, what is the role of the state versus the private sector versus communities in creating that infrastructure? By way of example, we see in some instances communities developing ICT and digital infrastructure much more quickly than the state or private sector is able to do it, or the adoption rate, at least in the private sector or in communities, outstripping that of the public sector, of government. And so are we solving the right problem? If government has failed to maintain infrastructure, is government coming to the party and correcting that really the solution, or is it a small part of the solution? And then to your second question, as I think it was Dion who said, there are very high-level policy agreements and policy documents, policy concepts about the need for collaboration across the continent. But really on the grassroots, at the fundamental level, we don't really see any stake on the plate growth and development in this outside of very few roads being built across borders. And so one of the things that I argue for in my paper is what I described there as a SADC habitability strategy. In other words, a comprehensive, societal-wide, ecologically minded strategy for SADC, around which SADC governments can crowd, and where the SADC as an institution can play a very important facilitation role to do exactly what you suggest, which is to accelerate our capacity for collaboration. And in some instances, and then I'll hand back to you, Letitia, in some instances, the infrastructure key that needs to be unlocked is not something that can be done in a country or a sub-region. It has to be done across the region. It has to be done east to west, north to south. And so finding those synergies is going to be very important. Letitia.
Thank you so much, Marius. We've got two questions. I'm going to put it together from Rolf Pretorius. And that's also for Marius. And then I think the next question would then go to Stephen. So the questions from Rolf are, how much progress is being made to start manufacturing of renewable energy generation goods like windmills, batteries, fuel cells inside the SADC area? And what is to be done to accelerate it so that green energy can start to create jobs for the youth of SADC countries? And is the creation of jobs not the way to mobilize societies around green energy and to draw them away from clinging to the old pro-fossil fuels way?
Thank you again for the great question. So the matter might be answered by saying that SADC is a mixed bag when it comes to renewable energy adoption, renewable energy manufacturing, as well as the regulatory landscape within the which adoption of renewables and the adoption of manufacturing of renewables is taking place. And so as a consequence of that mixed bag or uneven landscape, the job story is very different from country to country. So to paint a picture, if you look at the northern and particularly the northeastern parts of SADC, the countries in that part are largely importing renewable energy technologies, and they're largely importing them at a very small scale for household consumption. If you look to the southern parts, like in South Africa, we see an enormous uptake of renewable energy, solar power, battery technology, but that's largely being driven by the private sector and the upper income, upper LSM segments of the community, of society. Now, there's a structural reason for that. And the reason is that we have a particular infrastructure and energy market dominance by the state, in the case of South Africa, through the likes of Eskom. And that particular institution, with the regulatory framework surrounding it, has made this large commitment to coal historically, and has been relatively slow in moving away from hydrocarbons and coal in particular towards the IPPs, the independent power producers. And when it has made that move away from coal, it's done that with very large-scale projects for small numbers of private sector actors. Now, why do I emphasize these terms of large-scale, small numbers of private sector actors? Because the real potential in renewable energy, as you rightly point out through your question, is the proliferation of renewable energy manufacture, adoption, and use. And so I would imagine a future in which hundreds of thousands of young Africans are involved in a supply chain that is localized. We have the natural resources for the manufacture of components, for the component manufacturing of more sophisticated technologies, and then the distribution and maintenance and servicing of those components. Now, this does raise a very important question around sustainability: is can SADC, South Africa, or any other country produce these components in an environmentally sustainable way? Because what we don't want is to fall from one side of the ditch, from a coal-based, carbon environment harming energy system, into a manufacturing for renewables where the rest of the world get the renewables and we get the carbon that was produced in the process. And so we need to be very clever about manufacturing those components in sustainable ways. We absolutely have to do that in ways that are job creating. And so at the heart of your question is there progress? And I can say that in the last 5 years, we've seen the private sector, the likes of the manufacturing circle, knocking on the doors of the policymakers, saying, if you allow us the policy environment through the likes of wheeling contracts, where the private sector and citizens can put energy back into the grid, that will create the market conditions that will then create the competitiveness factors for us to manufacture those components locally. And so you have to understand that we're in an energy market, particularly around your question, where the market needs to be created by the regulations, which then the private sector can respond to, which then will create the jobs for those people to be employed. And so we are making progress in that direction. The presidency in South Africa, for instance, raising the quantum of energy that might be produced by a local manufacturer or producer of energy is a step in that direction. But we haven't quite liberalized the policy framework or policy environment sufficiently to unlock that market potential. If we do so, there, of course, is 1 billion people north of us in SADC, and 75%, 750 million of those people are in energy poverty. And so there's a huge market opportunity for SADC manufacturers to take advantage of.
Thanks so much, Marius. I hope that you can hear me now. We have a question. I think Stephen, this one is for you. It's from an anonymous attendee. And the question is, what can be said about green industrialization with regards to mining, more specifically the crucial role of critical minerals in SADC?
Yeah, really good question. To answer this, we need to kind of go more into a geopolitical sort of space, that anytime there's a scarcity on the planet, there's money to be made. And there is currently a green scramble occurring in Africa driven by Chinese, European interest. I think the US is a latecomer to this game. But the whole reality that just green industrialization relies upon minerals such as lithium and copper. I know that, you know, the report that was produced here, that the annual global supply of copper by 2035 is going to have to double. Zambia, Namibia, and the DRC are the first, third, and fifth largest exporters. So at the moment, a lot of the energy behind this and the momentum is still resource extraction. And if neocolonial methods are still needed to do that, this is going to be the method until SADC and other African nations can say, no, just as with fossil fuels, it's still crude oil is being exported and fuel is being imported into these countries. So I think something is very, very similar is happening here. And this is why the paper is advocating that green industrialization, it's premised on the idea that green industrialization is still embedded on these linear economic growth systems. And so this is where this need for a new paradigm that is regenerative, that when we look at Wall's continuum, green still sits right in the middle of this continuum. It's just business as usual in some ways. We're just greenwashing the terminology of a lot of what we're using. And how do we potentially change the paradigm? And the paradigm is going to have to be changed globally. But SADC being the source of a good chunk of, say, copper for the world, can say, wait a second, we want to approach this from a very different sort of perspective that is in harmony with nature, that is regenerative, is circular, is confined within this donut economic sort of model. But until that, the global players that will continue to infiltrate political elite in these countries and gain access to these minerals, the industrialization, you know, whether it's green or regenerative, is gonna suffer, I think, in that case.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm going to ask Dion to also just give a view on that in light of our recent papers that have also just been published.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think what's really interesting on that question is that we are in an interesting time, because what we see happening regarding critical minerals and what some call the new scramble for Africa is that you know, while this is a massive opportunity, as what we see is again a very reactive approach and not an anticipatory or proactive approach to critical minerals. Many countries are not ready; they don't have critical minerals, or let's name them rather green minerals in this context. National plans in place in terms of how to go about their planning and monitoring of how they want to go about the policy implementations of these approaches. Some countries have opted to ban exports of raw materials. Some are much open. I think the challenge is going to be to coordinate and find a regional response to, or an African-wide response to critical minerals. We are currently working with the African Minerals Development Center at the African Union to try and find a way to harmonize and find options and approaches that will enable you know, green industrialization through the exploitation or basically mining of critical minerals. And I think what our reports show is if we don't start cooperating and finding a harmonized and quite strong leaders that show a clear direction in this in the short term, then we are in for unfortunate perpetuation of the history that we've seen, the path dependency that we've seen. What we can do, however, is to really bring awareness to the general public, and communities that mining communities that want to be involved and really create the conditions. There are some pockets of the future in the present, or kind of positive developments, where you see some mining companies adopting green industrialization approaches, where they're going for mining trucks using green hydrogen, or they're going for large investments in solar and renewable energies to drive the energy. There can be some interesting approaches, but in general, what I think would make a large difference is to go on a regional renegotiation of the social contract for mining in the region where you see especially a kind of a reordering of equitable and balanced societal agreements regarding the ecology, regarding mutual care of the people inhabiting these areas, and also strengthening the cultural kind of immune system, if you might call it, towards really both finding an environmental responsible, socially responsible, as well as environmental and mineral stewardship, but really also better and more inclusive outcomes that would enable economic well-being in these regions rather than short-term profits and bad governance systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dion. We move over to our next question from Hashali. What are your thoughts on the proposed carbon tax system? I just want to check. I know we didn't discuss this. Mr. Melu, are you able to answer that question?
Look, I can certainly try, Letitia. Look, I don't think it's easily quantifiable exactly, how much it benefits anyone at this stage. But what certainly, from my understanding, what it's intended to do is actually give some reprieve towards poorer households in terms of how much they pay for energy under this carbon tax. But certainly what it can encourage is more people to go off the grid. And perhaps maybe to tie it into the other question that speaks about municipalities as well, is that once this is done, what it then means essentially for municipalities is that when more people go off the grid, because you need to remember that municipalities are tasked with providing services, and most of their revenue is done through collection in terms of how much people actually pay for the electricity. And since the electricity supply now, majority comes from fossil fuel agents, it then means that more people are going off the grid, and then essentially municipalities have a struggle providing this electricity. So it's a bit of a catch-22 at the moment. I don't think that there's a possible, quantifiable or tangible answer as to how people benefit from this tax break.
Thanks so much, Mr. Melu. Marius, your hand is up. I'm sure you also want to contribute to that rather interesting question.
Thank you, Letitia. Letitia, I think Mr. Melu might be referring to the tax incentive that's been created for the adoption of renewables, which is particularly to South Africa. But in case the participant was asking about the broader sort of global phenomena of carbon taxes, just to clarify, at least my understanding of that is the financial markets have, and other actors in the global economy have explored various mechanisms by which we might accelerate the decarbonization of the global economy. If you think about it in a very simplistic way, if there's a mine and that mine is mining coal and it's selling that coal to a factory and the factory is burning that coal, that mine with that factory is collectively producing a particular quantum of coal, of carbon that is being pumped into the atmosphere. And so let's call it 100 million tons a year. And so the question is, how do you move away from producing that 100 million tons a year of carbon in the atmosphere? That is going to require a financial investment in the transformation of the mine's industrial base, the mechanization, the machinery by which it operates, but also of the factory, of the energy sources it uses in producing things. And so the question is, how do we get the financial markets and the business sectors, the business and industry, to make those investments in transforming their operations. And so one of the mechanisms to accelerate that is by creating a carbon credit. And so, for instance, you might put a value on a forest somewhere in Brazil, and you might say that that forest has a carbon value. And the reason is because it's a carbon basin. It's a ecological machine that pulls carbon out of the atmosphere. And so, for instance, can the mine or the business, the factory, can they invest in owning a portion of that forest, or at least preserving that forest? In exchange for making that investment, they get a carbon credit. And in exchange for that carbon credit, they might be permitted to continue to offset that carbon that they're producing. And so there are many of these kinds of mechanisms. There is not a standard, even form of that around the world. But what some countries have decided to do, as opposed to trying to incentivize those investments through carbon credits, is to produce carbon taxes. In other words, how do we penalize companies for the amount of carbon that they produce? And can they then offset those by making new investments, reducing their carbon intake? An example of that might be the proposed carbon border tax that the European Union is putting on the table, that essentially will say that if you're a country or a company producing products using carbon outside of the European Union, you will pay an additional tax at the border, which will allow them to then fund the green transition. And so what they're really doing is they're, at the one hand, penalizing you for using carbon-based energy, but also incentivizing you to move away from that. And then my final comment will be, at the moment, the state of play in this carbon market space that I've been describing is that there isn't an even conception of it. There isn't an even adoption of it. Countries, groups of companies are all doing very different things. And so what I think we will see in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years is really a standardization of the way we treat carbon, whether we put a price on carbon at the global level, and at COP28, I'm sure this will be discussed, whether we then price carbon collectively, whether we then produce a single mechanism for carbon credits to be traded around the world. And as we do that, we will then start seeing an even playing field for a company in one part of the world to benefit from the renewable initiatives in another part, and vice versa, and hopefully move the entire global economy towards a less carbon intensive system, just to add some clarity to that.
Thanks so much, Marius. And just to add, I know we're speaking very much about infrastructure and industrialization, but the agricultural sector is also very much focused on carbon credits, to also promote food security. So this whole notion of carbon credits just touches on so many industries and sectors, and as you rightly pointed out, it cannot be ignored. We have a few more questions in the chat. I just want to make sure that I'm not skipping anyone. Mr. Melu touched on the point of municipalities. I'm going to ask Dion to maybe address this one. So what role or what will be needed for municipalities in South Africa to be partners in the discussions regarding green industrialization? Can you also speak on the financing of this? And that's from TK.
Yes, thank you. I think we will be publishing research on showing how, specifically on the green energy side, renewable energy side, the role of municipalities play a key role, and how they can get involved in switching to renewable energies, and we see the role of municipalities playing pioneering roles in many cases, as they have the type of less red tape in certain instances and more in other instances to get things done. The role is to really put forward these pioneering projects. You see the city of Cape Town pioneering a lot of options. You see other, even cities and the mayors in cities worldwide have been pioneers in terms of, might not be very practical for South Africa at this stage, but they, for instance, already banned a while ago the use of diesel vehicles in cities. Mayors, of course, in use in cities, which has significantly improved conditions of the citizens of these cities. So, I mean, those are kind of a random answer to your question, but I would like to point you to keep an eye out for the detailed discussion of that type of work on the role of municipalities in our what we have called geopolitical energy futures work. And if you send me an email, then I'll be able to connect you to that report. That work was done in conjunction with the Center for Sustainability Transitions that have a special focus in that area. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dion. Maybe you could just drop your email in the chat, and then if anybody else is interested in that upcoming research paper, then we can just include you or send you an invitation to the upcoming webinar as well. We have another question specifically for South Africa. Which key department is focusing on policy development for green technology? Because for now, government is, I think the word there is stuck on just transition thinking, as this is all about selling coal, etc. So I think this also touches on the previous research that Dion just spoke about. Dion, would you mind to just touch on this as well?
Yeah, sure. Let me just see. I think I don't have the ability at this stage to put my email address in the chat. So sorry, I was focusing on that. So what I do see is the policy. So just transition. I hope that I'm answering the right question here by the anonymous attendee, right?
Fine.
Yeah.
It's that
okay.
one.
So focusing on the policy development of green technology. So yes. South Africa's got the renewable energy master plan. We've got many plans that are in place. So the question is whether we again will see the coming together of minds, maybe through the instrument of the Presidential Climate Commission that has been doing some great work. So what we see in terms of just transition is real positive developments are reaching out to local communities, having tough discussions on the livelihoods of these people. And what we have to do and really need to start considering is that some people will definitely lose jobs, but if we go for advanced versions of and also speed up the availability of renewables in general, we might see a lot of job opportunities in this region in South Africa. However, those job opportunities might not be in the locations that were typically in, say, Mpumalanga. But there's also some key involved new developments with new technologies like green hydrogen and the repurposing of coal-fired power stations that one should really take a careful look at. I think there are some interesting developments. I'm probably not allowed to speak to that specifically, but for instance, if you repurpose one of the coal-fired power stations and through using of special technologies, then there is an option of stall through burning of coal, which might be frowned upon in a certain sense, but carbon abatement options are available. There's many other options which could enable the just transition to take place with and find a way to have less jobs lost in the coal sector. There is also a lot of work in the green hydrogen space of coal green hydrogen to X, which might include these key technological developments. So I think you won't see that happening quite fast. We're looking at probably only a 5 to 10 year window of real developments, and when the green hydrogen economy actually becomes a real proposition with actual projects of green hydrogen started in South Africa is probably for 3 to 4 years maybe, and the real economy will have an impact only in 10 years. So speaking about that, in terms of green industrialization, is quite an interesting field to keep your eye on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dion. We have another question. I'm going to pose this one to Marius and Dion as well. It talks about considering resource extraction of critical minerals from SADC is key to helping the green transition. What can foreign investors, state and or private, do to help or ensure that the communities, countries and regions also benefit from this and minimize the consequences? That's a question from Nicholas.
Thank you, Letitia. It's such a great question. I think that it's probably worthwhile thinking about that in two ways. One is, what can they do immediately? In the case of South Africa, we do have the emergence of the new mining charter with some thinking around the corporate social responsibility of mines. I think we can take those kinds of initiatives much, much more seriously, not just in South Africa, but across SADC. And there's a real need in the short term to involve communities, to consider not just the mine, but the communities of mining, which is the immediate communities around mines, in everything from the ecological impact of mining, training and development, involving communities in the job creation processes of mining, maximizing the way in which the mines operations can advance the infrastructure, whether it's clinics, whether it's roads, whether it's homes for those communities. I think that's the short-term answer. But there's a more fundamental conversation needed, and I think Dion alluded to this when he spoke about the need for a reconstitution of the social contract around mining. If we think about the history of SADC and Africa around colonialism and the very important role that resource extraction played in enabling that extractive relationship between populations in Africa and the markets and populations elsewhere, then there's a real need to, at a fundamental level, reimagine the way in which natural resource endowments are going to transform the legacies of colonialism and the role that natural resource endowment has to play now in the current decade and in the next century in enabling populations in Africa not only to survive and thrive, but to catch up and in some instances be at a peer-to-peer level with global peers around development. And so I think there's a need to fundamentally re-articulate a social compact where natural resources is the bedrock on which societal development can take place. And so if we start speaking about things like national development plans, investment strategies of governments, even of the private sector, conceptualizing the role of these rare earth metals and other inputs into the just energy transition and into the broader economic transition, the role of communities and the ecology being taken account of at the heart of those strategies is going to be very important. And this is something, maybe let me end by saying, this is something that's going to require an immense amount of leadership. If we sit back and expect decision makers in the private sector who have short-term incentives, who have shareholders, who are often profit-orientated, to provide that leadership, it's unlikely to happen. If we expect the governments to lead that charge, it's unlikely to happen. And so we do need a new crop of societal leaders. They might come from business, they might come from the public sector, but societal leaders that can articulate what I would describe as a generational need to place resource extraction at the center of societal good. That is something that's going to have to happen in the next decade or two.
Thank you, Marius. Dion, maybe you could just touch on the new social contract that you spoke about earlier. I think it would also just be able to provide some insights to answer this question.
Yeah, so I mean, these are really trying. Sorry, can you hear me now? I can't hear you.
Yes, we can hear you now, loud and clear.
Okay.
We can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of the social contract, it's part of our research on the critical mineral side that there's a whole host of key issues to to reimagine and rethink and renegotiate at all levels of society, within government, civil society, business, and the wider communities. What we want to see is that this type of conversation is led at kind of national level, but also ground up. The challenge that we've seen is that in terms of the only 10% of our Southern Africa's GDP is in the mining sector, but this can be grown substantially, and Southern Africa is very dependent on these potential kind of green mineral supply chains. So what we want to see is that this type of challenges, like the cost of living crisis, within the context of the climate emergency that is creating global crises and as well as regional crises in terms of destruction of wildlife. We have the Malawi floods, we have droughts, we have several challenges, as well as the economic and governance challenges and political challenges. You have to find a way to renegotiate this balanced approach to equitable agreements within our societal boundaries. I think it's a way overdue that even within South Africa's context, while we have seen a significant improvement in democratic principles and practices, what we can call energy poverty remains, and there's not a kind of democracy in place, or economic democracy in place. And what we would like to see is that economic well-being is prioritized along with ecological well-being, along with social well-being, along with personal well-being. So that these aren't at the kind of a short-term, at the whims of the short-term politicians, but rather speak to long-term intergenerational fairness in how social contracts are created and negotiated. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Dion. I think we've covered all the questions in the chat. And that brings us to wrapping up very, very briefly. I think just to point out the severity of the problem and what's needed for this new social contract is, Marius pointed out that 750 million people are still in energy poverty today as we speak, which is a very scary stat. And it just necessitates that new social contract to come about sooner rather than later. So just to sum up, we've had a very insightful and active audience. So I want to thank the webinar participants for engaging in the dialogue and for your very insightful and well thought out questions. I also want to thank our panelists, Marius, Stephen, Nsimelelu, as well as Dion, for your answers and contributions to this very much needed research. And I would also like to encourage everyone to complete our evaluation form, which is, I know there's a link to that in the chat. And let me just check if there's not any last minute questions that has come up. Oh, I see we do have a last minute question from Moses. And the question is, how can the issue of security of energy supply, low access to reliable and affordable energy can be addressed while considering the just energy transition and green industrialization economy? So I think it's back to this whole issue of energy security, low access and affordability.
Yeah,
I think nexus.
Yeah, so I would like Marius as well as Stephen to also just jump in here, but if I just may have an initial stand, is that within the just energy transition conversation, we need to adopt a kind of a holistic understanding of these different narratives. The larger narrative is to adopt what in general is called a energy democracy approach, which changes the game on the rules of the game in terms of ownership, where we see a monopolized, in general, state-orientated energy generation approach within probably the entire region, where especially in South Africa, for now, we have the independent power producers creating more of late only some capabilities, but what you need to do is to create alternative forms of ownership, community-led ownership, cooperative-led ownership, municipal-led ownership, provincial-led ownership. There's so many forms of ownership that should be explored within this larger discussion of a social contract, because there's lots of things that play. Energy. Without energy, the entire world will not be available to pursue any forms of growth, whether it's green growth or the likes. And within the green growth paradigm, there's also real challenges to make this work if one does not adopt a fast and proactive approach to put the type of conditions and policy instruments in place that would enable a real just energy transition. Back to maybe Marius and Stephen for last words.
Thank you,
yeah,
Letitia.
So sorry, Marius, I see, before you address that, there's another specific question directed at you. There's a need to train new or capacitate community leaders to think deeply and take the issue of recontracting the relationship. So I think maybe if you could address that one as well.
Thank you, Letitia. So I think a good starting point in the World Energy Council, we talk of what we call the energy trilemma, which is also that happens to be the name of a study that we bring out every few years to really reflect on balancing these three imperatives of energy access and affordability, which is what the question is about, energy sustainability, environmental sustainability, and then energy security. You know, energy security is a national imperative. It's an industrial imperative. Without energy security, if you have the lights go off, you lose economic value. People don't have opportunities. It has massive negative impacts. Think about a hospital without electricity. But we need to balance those three. We need to have energy security, which means we need to use the sources available to us, but we also need to be environmentally sustainable, but we have to do that in a way that is affordable. And this is the real challenge of our time. If you're in Africa, if you're in SADC, it probably is the case that energy access and affordability is top of mind, almost more important than security and sustainability, because people are desperate, people are in energy poverty. But we have to, from the outset, make the commitment to all three of those and find creative ways and pathways to get us there. Now, as we think about energy transition, there is an element around costs, not just the cost of investment in new technologies or new infrastructure, but there's also the cost to be borne by nations such as South Africa or other nations who are coal dependent for the pollution of other nations over time. And so this notion of cost apportionment, who pays for energy transition in a world where some countries have advanced and developed, often at the back of or at the cost of other countries, and now we're paying an ecological cost. If we look at the energy, at the environmental commons, our water, our air, our oceans are paying the price. And as society, as global society, we have to apportion those costs appropriately. And so when we think about energy affordability, it's not just a simple matter of, is the energy we pay for at a cost point that we can afford with our income? It's also about, as society, as countries, how do we apportion those costs? And this is where the regulations, the policies we make, and the global agreements like the Paris Agreement that we enter into have to be done within the context of a fair structure, understanding who pays their fair share. And I know that the leaders of global South countries, of developing countries, are at the table making the case that our affordability is not undermined negatively in such a way that it undermines our progress, even while we commit ourselves to things like ecological commitments and sustainability. And I think the question about skills is linked to that one of the costs of an energy transition is moving coal mine workers into other sectors. It's equipping communities, making the investments in communities to have the skills to be part of energy systems of the future. And of course, if we reconceptualize infrastructure to be regenerative, then it opens up the question of what are the skills needed to both build those infrastructures, but also to benefit from those infrastructures. Thank you, Letitia.
Thanks so much, Marius. We've got one last question. Stephen, I'm going to pose that one to you. What are some things foreign investors don't often know or fail to understand about engaging with SADC or within the SADC region, and what ought they to know?
Yeah, again, a great question. I don't, Marius actually, I think, had a couple of visuals, but there's one in the report that Dion and I prepared that talks about, again, so many investors come in thinking, I think, at a state-centric sort of level, and obviously that is a key priority that you have to work with. But again, we have some of these boundaries, and some of the challenges are not really related to states, but related to regions across SADC. Whether it's, say, the wealth that resides in the Congo Basin, which cuts across multiple countries, to the arid and semi-arid areas of the Kalahari and so forth, where environmental conditions are very different. So that state-centric lens, I think, still dominates the way people think of engaging with the state. And so you might have a state that's very supportive of investment opportunities, but the repercussions of that investment are actually going to influence other states in that area. So you need to look at it from a systems perspective, both at the SADC level, but also what is actually happening down on the ground. So look at the social, economic, the cultural sort of elements, the eco sort of systems that are involved. So there's a depth to it and a scope to it that is beyond just a state-centric sort of focus. So Dion, Marius, you might have ideas there as well.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So in terms of this issue of foreign investment and the failings, I think it is also coming up to again to the political level. There's too many directions in terms of governments not always speaking, dancing according to the same tune. And what we need to find is that we have a clear understanding of what direction and what vision South Africa wants to go in terms of our long-term futures and short-term futures. And I think that that is in many cases it's Southern Africa we need to go. The role of SADC Secretariat is very important, but we do see, and I'll stress this point, that this issue of the sovereignty of member states currently is overwhelming the issue of and importance of regional integration, harmonization, and the cooperation that's required and collaboration that's required. So important institutions like the SADC Business Council is doing good work there, but the challenge remains that we see not all involvement that we would like to see member states have in really getting on the working with SADC Secretariat, enabling them to make sure that the plans that are in place are really attended to, as well as actionable, and the type of investment and financial arrangements are made to really follow through on the many policy recommendations that there are. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dion. I think just to wrap up from my side, and I'll try and summarize this discussion as best I can. I think for me, what really stands out is, and I'll call it the Marius lock-on, lock-in features, which is I think in the mind, it just creates a different way of looking at things. And it talks so well into this whole paradigm shift that is needed if we say we want to make a real impactful change. Both papers talk about 3 scenarios. Just reflecting on this discussion today, there is just so much more than 3 scenarios. And that's the key of futures or foresight work, is that we are having a discussion at a point in time, but your work is never really done when it comes to futures and foresight work. It's a constant iterative process. And the more we engage with the content and the more we start acting differently, we will still continue to build these capacities for change. Also, this whole notion of ESGs, it's evolving constantly. We're also looking at new global finance models. Marius also spoke about the carbon credits, and then we had some not so good insights from the audience about, but who's it going to serve? I think it's still a bit too early days to make a real judgment on it. I think sometimes we need to test things and see what works, and then change the approach and then retest it again. Stephen also spoke about regenerative principles and approaches. And Stephen, you raise a good point that with more funding, one can do more deeper work. And I think that is a general theme that comes across most research, is that, your funding can only take you so far. And there is this cry for, if we have more funding, we can actually do deeper work. And with deeper work, we can really unpack and change those mental models and change those paradigms that's needed to really unearth this regenerative economic principles. You also spoke about systems change and this whole transformative change. We can do a cut and paste job and do what other economies have done, but we would then lack that transformative change, which is so needed. Also, your African about face model, which I thought was quite insightful, talks about innovations in forward and advanced economies, where one looks at human development indexes, but yeah, African has also got the African knowledge systems, and how do we leverage those through regenerative cultures, etc. Also, the rethinking of infrastructures and new technologies also can pave the way for industrialization and infrastructures. But yeah, someone also raised the important point that SADC has this massive uneven landscape. And I think we all have a duty to leave no one behind, as we've already seen with the 750 million people who are currently in energy poverty. We also know that there's this whole scramble for Africa with the minerals, where advanced economies are securing their supply chains, and Africa becomes the center stage, and there's a responsibility to ensure that our policies are aligned to support the communities better, so that we have more equitable industrialization and infrastructures. We also move towards this, I think John spoke about this economic democracy in line with economic and ecological well-being. So we need to balance more balls. It makes you think of that clown with the different balls or juggler rather. And each ball has got the same level of importance. You can't drop one ball because then you fail to become a juggler. So we will begin to see more and more of these issues. And I think it was Marius who spoke about the energy trilemma. where we need to consider security, affordability, and access if we are going to make meaningful change. So thank you very much. This has been quite an insightful webinar, and I thank all our participants and especially our panelists for your contributions, and we hope to hear from you in future. Thanks so much. Bye-bye. I see we've still got some more questions. No, I think we have addressed all our questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.